With breaking news, Statistics Canada has just released data for May's Consumer Price Index. Inflation was up 3.2% year over year. That beat expectations too, that we were expecting.
Canada just got its retail sales numbers, and the headline looks fine until you read past the first sentence. Sales rose 0.5% month over month, which sounds like progress. It does not tell you that this number is being inflated by the rising price of gasoline, not by Canadians actually buying more things. The volume of actual goods purchased is flat. The consumer is exhausted, and the consumer is the only thing left holding this economy together.
Good morning, Lindsay.
So what's your reaction to the latest retail sales data? Did this also fall slightly below what you were expecting?
Well, in fact, not really. I think when we look at the value of retail sales, they did increase, and it's largely on inflation pressure. So it's the...
When economists talk about retail sales, there are two ways to read the number. There is the nominal value, which is the dollar amount spent, and there is the volume, which measures how much stuff people are actually buying at a base price. Right now, the nominal value is up because gasoline costs more. The volume is essentially flat. Pedro Antunes, chief economist at Signal 49 Research, said plainly that when you dig below the surface, the quantity of goods people are purchasing is very, very flat.
Price of goods, especially gasoline prices, that are driving up the kind of nominal value of retail sales. But when you dig below the surface a little bit and you look at the volume, in other words, the quantity of stuff that people are purchasing at, at a base price, that is actually very, very flat. And
core spending, meaning necessities like food and everyday consumer staples, is actually declining in volume terms. The one category showing any real life is building supplies and construction materials, and that number is seasonally adjusted. So even that silver lining is thin. The broader picture, once you strip out the gasoline price effect, is a Canadian consumer who is purchasing less and less of the things they need to live.
The consumer is generally fairly weak, but in fact, it's the consumer that's been more or less holding up the economy in the last year, and so we're worried about where we're headed going forward. If consumer spending does ease up any further, it's the last bastion holding up our fairly weak economy, as we know.
The reason this matters so much is that consumer spending has been the last engine keeping the Canadian economy from stalling out completely. Statistics Canada confirmed that Canada was in a technical recession over the last 2 quarters of 2024. What pulled it back from the edge was consumer spending. But here is the part the government will not put in a press release: that spending was funded partly by Canadians drawing down their savings. Aggregate savings declined significantly in the first quarter of 2025. People were spending money they did not really have.
Well, again, it's that I go back to the volume, the amount of stuff. And when we look at the last year, as you know, Statistics Canada told us we were in a technical recession over the last 2 quarters. And what had held up consumer spending, certainly in the last quarter, in the first quarter of this year, had been consumers. But that happened with a drawdown in our aggregate savings.
Canadians owe $1.77 for every dollar of disposable income they earn. Total household debt reached $3.2 trillion by the end of 2025, which amounts to 177% of household disposable income. That makes Canada the most indebted household sector in the entire G7, including the United States, which sits at 76% of GDP. The government watched this happen for years. Mark Carney did not stumble into a debt crisis. He inherited one that federal and provincial governments helped build through years of low-rate policy dependency and a housing market that turned debt into a lifestyle.
Well, Statistics Canada has just released the latest Canadian retail numbers. They are up 0.5% month over month for the month of April, too. A little bit off of initial expectations, too. The survey was at 0.6%. For some more reaction and in-depth analysis, we are joined.
The mortgage renewal wave is making all of this worse. About 60% of all outstanding mortgages in Canada will renew by the end of 2026. Millions of households that locked in pandemic-era rates of around 2% are now rolling into rates nearly double that. The Bank of Canada's own analysis showed payment increases of 15% to 20% for 5-year fixed-rate borrowers renewing in 2025 or 2026. That translates to anywhere from $300 to $800 more per month, depending on the balance and the province. For younger and lower-income households, that increase does not come from nowhere. It comes directly out of what they were spending on food, clothing, and everything else.
March was not great either, but the months before, you could see some strength building, or at least some resilience in consumer spending gradually building. So it's kind of suggested that consumers were on a better footing before we had the energy shock.
Toronto is where you can see the full damage most clearly. Mortgage arrears in the Greater Toronto area have more than quadrupled from their post-pandemic lows. The CMHC project's delinquency pressures in the GTA will remain elevated throughout 2026. Falling home prices in Toronto and Vancouver, down 4% to 6% year over year, are making the situation even harder to escape. Homeowners cannot sell their way out of trouble in a softening market. They cannot tap equity that has shrunk. They are essentially trapped with a higher monthly payment and no relief valve.
As we look at what's happening, at least for right now, when it comes to inflation and otherwise, I think maybe looking to a little bit more strength, and we'll see what happens in the Middle East. But overall, to just expand upon that a little bit to what we could see here, and what we're going to see for the next couple of months once we get that data.
Yeah, well, I think when we look at it on a kind of a longer perspective, yes.
The Bank of Canada's own consumer survey found that Canadians perceive a higher likelihood of missing a debt payment than they did in previous quarters. Spending plans reported by consumers have weakened. The survey recorded one respondent who put it simply, "It is tough for my family. We have to budget more. We buy less wants and more needs." That sentence is the entire Canadian consumer economy in 2026 summarized. Ottawa's response has been to watch.
It's concerning more in terms of it shows weakness on the consumer side. However, the question is always how much of that weakness was not expected. We knew with the energy shock that we would see a rough patch for consumer spending. I think for now, it's really as we get with the data from June, July, and we see kind of more normalization into energy prices.
A Stifel survey of 300 Canadians published in April 2026 found that only 52% of respondents expected to increase discretionary spending over the next 12 months. That is the lowest reading in 4 quarters and down 200 basis points from January. Apparel spending intentions sat at their weakest point since tracking began. Furniture and appliance spending intentions fell approximately 500 basis points from January. Quick service restaurant spending entered contractionary territory, with fewer than half of respondents planning to increase what they spend on food outside the home. This is not a temporary blip. This is a consumer who is rationing. Ontario is feeling this harder than the rest of the country. It is the manufacturing heartland, the most exposed province to US tariffs, and now it is being hit by a combination of trade disruption, mortgage stress, and stagnant wages all at once. Quebec has shown more resilience in part because it is less trade dependent with the US. Alberta's retail sales actually fell 1.9% in February 2026, with vehicle purchases leading the drop. Wages in Alberta have underperformed the national average for years, leaving households with less cushion heading into this downturn. No province is in great shape, but Ontario and Alberta are in the worst of it. And those are also the provinces that Ottawa claims to govern on behalf of.
Oh, we knew retail sales would be boosted because we saw plus 0.5. It's a bit weaker, but most of it is boosted by gasoline prices. So that was what we expected. But even when we removed that, also there was some big contribution from motor vehicle sales. Once we removed those factors, we're actually kind of broadly flat in terms of retail sales. So it's a bit of a...
CoStar published an analysis in May 2026, warning that Toronto's retail sector is nearing a turning point. Toronto's unemployment rate has already climbed to nearly 9%. Forward-looking surveys historically lead actual spending declines by several months, which means the weakness visible in those surveys right now will show up in the hard retail data later this year. Smaller retailers with thinner margins and weaker cash positions are most exposed. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz has pushed fuel and transportation costs higher, which reduces what households can spend on anything that is not fuel. The pressure is compressing from multiple directions at once.
As we look at what's happening, at least for right now, when it comes to inflation and otherwise, I think maybe looking to a little bit more strength, and we'll see what happens in the Middle East. But overall, to just expand upon that a little bit to what we could see here, and what we're going to see for the next couple of months once we get that data.
When consumer spending weakens enough, it does not just affect retail stores. It spreads into business investment decisions. Companies do not hire more people or open new locations into a shrinking consumer market. Business investment has already been pulling back. Trade has been disrupted by the tariff war with the United States. There is no trade agreement on the horizon that would restore the cross-border flow of goods to anything resembling normalcy. Pedro Antunes was direct about this when he said that if consumer spending dies out, the economy needs either trade or business investment to pick up the slack. And neither of those components are doing well right now.
And hopefully, as I said, hold up the volume of consumer spending on other things, especially on those core products that have been suffering in recent months.
What else could help really hold up consumer spending?
The advance estimate for May retail sales points to a 1% increase, and some commentators will call that a rebound. Do not let them. May's number will include the same gasoline price distortion that has been inflating the nominal figures for months. Real volume growth, the kind that reflects Canadians actually buying more things, will almost certainly look different once the data is stripped of the energy price effect. The government will issue a press release about resilience. The people at the pump, at the grocery store, and at the mortgage renewal table will not feel it.
Advanced estimates for May show a rise of about 1% when it comes to retail sales. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but if we see gas prices ease, as you were just talking about, could that free up household budgets for more discretionary spending moving forward?
Yeah, that would be the better news, that we do see essentially inflationary pressures come down, especially on the gasoline side.
Mark Carney has been talking about building an economy. The numbers say Canada does not currently have one worth speaking of. GDP has been essentially flat since the end of 2024. Employment growth has stalled over the same period. The consumer kept the lights on by spending down savings. The savings are gone. The mortgage payments are higher. The jobs are not materializing. Ottawa's solution has been to hold rates, watch the data, and wait. The data is telling them something. The question is whether they will admit it.